So we don't have a round table as such, but we have some, I think, great resources to talk about archival issues.
So I've been in a lot of places, and I'm going to give some lessons. In a few minutes, I'll tell you some lessons I think I've learned about the organization and use of archives. Now, in all of this, I have learned some lessons, but I want to begin with one observation, and this is from my own experience. Archival work is very hard, and it's mostly unrewarding. It is, you travel a long ways, you get a short time to spend with the papers, usually. I associate it with starvation and dehydration. Now, what is the lesson that you can draw from this? The lesson is that you should absolutely emphasize ease of access. It is not a time to think about restrictions. Digitization of archival materials is important, is useful, but it presents a huge number of new problems. I think the archives, while I said it's mostly unrewarding work, I mean by that the number of things that you find that are really important and interesting are few. But when you find them, they're wonderful.
David asked me to speak just very briefly about my role. I'm the general editor of the Hyatt Collected Works. I was invited to do that by the second general editor back in the early 2000s. I said, sure, this sounds like a chance of a lifetime to really get to know his works better. And in the contract was this clause that said, oh, and you'll become the literary executor. I had no idea what that meant, but I said, well, sure, why not? Doesn't sound like a problem. So creation of the Economist Papers Archive at Duke. Of course, Crawford Goodwin ended up being a key figure in this, but not as an historian of economics. Back in the 1980s, Crawford was dean of the graduate school at Duke, and this was the period when Duke was trying to say we need to imagine a new future for ourselves. We're no longer just going to be a regional university. We want to step onto the national university stage.
Yeah, so now we're going to have a real archivist.
Yes.
Right.
Thank you. Yes, although my story is not going to be nearly as colorful, I don't think, as it was in the past. So we have grown, and we have a lot of apparatus in place to deal with the papers and try to make them accessible. So I wanted to talk about the process of actually making papers available, and the cataloging and the processing and the whole acquisition actually begins well before the papers even come to the library. It begins, of course, with identifying potential donors, and as a curator for the archive, I'm writing those letters of introduction and saying, have you kept papers? Have you thought about a repository for them? And would you consider Duke? And I try to make my case, even though there are a few other repositories that are very fine places for the critical mass that we've developed and the resources that we can bring to papers. The Economist Archive, like my colleagues in other areas in the Rubenstein Library, we're really interested in, as archivists, in representing the whole of history in as much as we can, given all of our biases and what's available. And we're very interested in diversifying the voices among economists. So we're interested especially in women economists and people of color, to adding those papers as well.
First of all, I guess I'd note that my view of archives has really improved over the past few years. Not the sense of what the archives are doing, but the importance of archival research. And that's because I've also done a lot of oral histories, or at least interviewed a lot of people, former policymakers, former economists, former students of various economists I was interested in, and the fallibility of human memory is absolutely phenomenal. Even when you're asking a policymaker or an economist about their previous work, even if it's 15 years ago or so. They've moved on, and a lot of memory has been lost. So having written records is absolutely critical and crucial to getting an accurate assessment of the historical record. Why is it important to do archival research? I guess I have three reasons why. First of all, it is actually fun. It really is fun. Yes, there's the dehydration factor and the boredom factor and the stiff back and neck factor, but you get these little finds that are just keep you going. And even if they don't make it into a paper or a book, you learn something and it gives you important context. And two, related to that is you do get a sense for the topic you're looking into. If you just judge an economist by their published work, That's a small fraction, I think, of them as a totality. And you don't know how that came about, and what were the factors behind it, and what was their real point, which is sometimes obscured when you're writing for a purely academic audience. And you can pierce that veil a little bit, and you get a sense for the person by going through their papers. And then third is you can correct the record, because a lot of stories, I think, get passed down, or told, or anecdotes or what have you, and by looking at the actual memos or historical record, you pin down dates, you pin down sequences of events, you pin down how things were unfolding in a way that, once again, sort of anecdotes that are told sometimes miss.